She stood there in the rain, her small frame shaking, tears mixing with raindrops as she clutched a worn teddy bear. "Hug me tight," she whispered to the stuffed animal, unaware that the man watching from his luxury car would soon change her life forever. Alexander Reed, with his billions and empty mansion, had never felt so hollow until that moment, when a homeless child's pain shattered his carefully constructed walls. If this story already has you feeling something, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Now, let's dive deeper into this journey that will take both Alexander and little Sophie from strangers to family in the most unexpected way. Alexander Reed had everything money could buy, a fortune built from tech innovations, properties spanning continents, and a name that opened every door. Yet at 42, he found himself alone, divorced twice, estranged from his only brother, and surrounded by people who wanted his wealth, not his company. The rain pounded against his Bentley as his driver navigated through downtown, where the gleaming skyscrapers gave way to forgotten streets where society's overlooked gathered. That's when he saw her. A girl no older than 7, huddled under a store awning, talking to a ragged teddy bear as if it were her only friend in the world. Something about her pierced through his carefully constructed indifference. Perhaps it was the way she gently stroked the bear's matted fur, promising it that things would get better, even as her own situation seemed hopeless. "Stop the car," he commanded, surprising his driver who had worked for him for 8 years and rarely heard him speak more than necessary directions. The rain soaked through his custom suit as he approached her, but for once, Alexander didn't care about appearances. "Hello there," he said, crouching down to her level. "Are you alone?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I have Mr. Buttons," she said, holding up the teddy bear. "He keeps me safe." "I'm Alexander." "What's your name?" "Sophie," she whispered, clutching the bear tighter. "Sophie Williams." "Where are your parents, Sophie?" Her lower lip trembled. "Mommy's in heaven." "Daddy." She trailed off, looking down at her worn shoes. "Daddy said he'd come back. He promised 3 days ago." Alexander felt something crack inside him, a wall he'd built after his own childhood of emotional neglect. He'd been luckier than Sophie, his parents had provided material comfort while withholding love. But this child had nothing, not even shelter from the storm. "Would you and Mr. Buttons like to get something to eat? Somewhere dry?" Sophie studied him with a wisdom beyond her years. "Daddy said not to go with strangers." "That's very smart advice," Alexander nodded. "How about this, we can go to that diner across the street. You can sit by the window, and if you see your dad, you can leave right away." After a moment's consideration, Sophie nodded. Alexander resisted the urge to take her hand, respecting her boundaries as they crossed the street to a modest diner that stood in stark contrast to the Michelin-starred restaurants he frequented. Inside, Sophie ordered hot chocolate and pancakes, her eyes widening as the waitress placed the steaming plate before her. She carefully positioned Mr. Buttons on the seat beside her, making sure he could see the food. "Mr. Buttons says thank you," she said solemnly. "He's very welcome," Alexander replied, finding himself smiling genuinely for the first time in months. As Sophie ate, Alexander made discreet calls. His team of lawyers and private investigators were the best money could buy, and within hours, they uncovered the tragic reality. Sophie's mother had indeed passed away from cancer 6 months ago. Her father, overwhelmed by grief and mounting medical debts, had turned to alcohol and eventually abandoned his daughter 3 days earlier. Police reports indicated he had been found dead of an overdose in a motel room that morning. Alexander felt a weight of responsibility he'd never experienced before. He looked at Sophie, now falling asleep against Mr. Buttons, and made a decision that would change both their lives. The next weeks were a blur of social services meetings, court appearances, and background checks. Alexander's wealth expedited processes but couldn't eliminate them. He hired the best child psychologists, transformed a wing of his mansion into a child-friendly space, and even attended parenting classes, something that amused his executive assistant to no end. "You're really doing this?" his brother Marcus asked during a rare phone call. "Taking in some random kid? Is this a midlife crisis or a publicity stunt?" "Neither," Alexander replied, watching Sophie from across the room as she showed Mr. Buttons the garden from the window. "It's just the right thing to do." The transition wasn't smooth. Sophie had nightmares that left her screaming for her parents. She distrusted the luxury around her, preferring to sleep on the floor rather than the canopy bed Alexander had installed. She hoarded food in her pockets, afraid it might disappear. Each behavior was a knife to Alexander's heart, a reminder of her trauma. "Hug me tight," she would whisper to Mr. Buttons during these episodes, refusing human touch. Alexander would sit nearby, not pushing, just present until her breathing steadied and she drifted back to sleep. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, Alexander found himself telling Sophie about his own childhood. "I had a big house too," he said softly. "But it wasn't really a home. My parents were always too busy to hug me or tell me stories." Sophie looked at him with those solemn eyes. "That's sad. Everyone needs hugs." "Yes," he agreed, throat tight. "Everyone does. Mr. Buttons can hug you," she offered, extending the worn teddy bear. "He's good at it." Alexander gently took the bear, this treasured possession she was willing to share. "Thank you, Sophie. That's very kind." The breakthrough came 3 months later. Alexander had created a charitable foundation in Sophie's mother's name, dedicated to supporting single parents with medical needs. At the opening ceremony, Sophie stood beside him, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, Mr. Buttons tucked under her arm. As Alexander concluded his speech about second chances and found families, Sophie suddenly reached for his hand. The simple gesture, her tiny fingers wrapping around his, nearly undid him completely. That night, as he tucked her in, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Are you going to leave too?" The question gutted him. "No, Sophie. I promise I'm not going anywhere." She studied his face, searching for truth. "Pinky promise?" Alexander linked his little finger with hers. "Pinky promise." Then, instead of reaching for Mr. Buttons, she held her arms out to Alexander. "Hug me tight," she whispered, and for the first time, the words were directed at him. Alexander gathered her close, his expensive shirt absorbing her tears as years of her stored grief finally found release. His own tears fell into her hair as something inside him broke open and began to heal. The billionaire who had everything discovered that the embrace of a child who had nothing was the most valuable thing he'd ever received. Years passed. Sophie grew from a traumatized child into a confident teenager with Alexander's unwavering support. She kept Mr. Buttons on a shelf in her room, still important but no longer her only source of comfort. Alexander's company expanded its philanthropic work, focusing particularly on children in foster care and families in crisis. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, Sophie, now 12, presented Alexander with a handmade card. Inside, she'd written simply, "Thank you for stopping your car that day. Love, your daughter." It was the first time she'd called herself his daughter, though the adoption had been finalized years earlier. Alexander, the man once known for his ruthless business acumen and emotional detachment, found himself speechless with joy. That night, as they sat in the garden watching fireflies, Sophie asked about her biological father. Alexander had always been honest with her, in age-appropriate ways, about her parents. "Do you think he was a bad person?" she asked quietly. Alexander considered his words carefully. "I think he was a person in pain who made bad choices. Sometimes people get so lost in their own suffering that they can't see a way forward. Like you were? Before you found me?" Her perception startled him. "Yes," he admitted. "I was very lost. Very alone. But not anymore, she said with certainty. No, he agreed, putting his arm around her shoulders. Not anymore. The story of the billionaire and the abandoned girl eventually made its way to the media. Alexander declined most interview requests, protective of Sophie's privacy, but they did participate in a documentary about found families and the foster care system, hoping their experience might help others. When asked what had compelled him to stop his car that rainy day, Alexander always gave the same answer: I saw someone who needed help. The real question is, why doesn't everyone stop? Sophie grew into a compassionate young woman who combined her father's business acumen with a deep empathy for others. She established her own initiatives within the Reed Foundation, focusing specifically on children's mental health and support for grieving families. On her 18th birthday, Alexander presented her with a small box. Inside was a gold charm bracelet with 2 pendants, a teddy bear and a raindrop. To remember where we started, he said. Sophie fastened it around her wrist, then hugged him tight, no longer the desperate embrace of a frightened child but the loving gesture of a daughter to her father. The best things in life, she told him, come from the moments when we're brave enough to stop the car and step into the rain. Alexander Reed, once defined by his billions, found himself redefined by love. The man who had built empires discovered that his greatest achievement was helping a broken little girl become whole again, and in doing so, finding his own healing. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that family isn't always about blood, it's about who stays in the rain with you, who helps you heal, and who promises to never leave. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest hands hold the greatest power to change a life.